Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore, where today we are going to discuss the Black Arks of Naggaroth, which is in reality a bit of a misleading name, as more correctly they should be referred to as the Black Arks of Ulthuan, since that is of course where they all came from originally. The Black Arks themselves are the once fortresses and strongholds of Malekith and his supporters. But during his failed bid for the Phoenix throne, when the gods of the High Elves burned him and cast him from their grace, which turned out to just be a bit of a funny joke actually. But let's not get into end times lore and how goddamn stupid it is. Malekith was, of course, eventually defeated in the Elven civil war known as the Sundering, and Imric of Calador, or Calador I, as he would become known upon ascending the Phoenix throne, ousted Malekith and his followers from the capital and threatened to pursue them to their ancestral holds and wipe them out forever. And with their leader, Malekith, having been severely burned to the point of death by the sacred fires of Assyrian, were no longer in a position to offer any further resistance. Flight was the only option, but how? How could they bring with them all of their warriors, all of their extended family, all of their wealth and strength across the sea far enough to avoid the wrath of their high elf cousins? The answer was enormous ancient rituals that would tear pieces of Ulthuan itself and turn them into gargantuan floating fortresses. The first Black Arks. Even as the remainder of Malekith's once homeland of Naggaroth began to sink beneath the greedy waves, these vessels set sail for an uncertain future. Having lost the war, Malekith now found himself in opposition to the Phoenix throne, which in turn placed him in opposition to half the world. As despite the tremendous damage wrought by the Civil War and the racking earthquakes of the Sundering itself, Ulthuan remained a mighty foe, with colonies scattered all across the seas and in large portions of what is today known as the Old World. The only rivaling power structure at the time was the enormous dwarven empire of the World's Edge Mountains. And despite Malekith's personally close relationship with the then High King Gotrek Starbreaker, he reckoned the dwarves would not be too sympathetic to his plight. And thus there really were only a handful of places to which Malekith and his supporters could flee. And dogged every step of the way by high elf fleets, the choice was in essence made for Malekith and his supporters. They could only head north, to lands previously deemed utterly inhospitable and unlivable. Having been forced ashore there, Malekith founded the first city of Naggaroth, and dubbed in turn the surrounding lands, in honor of their now lost homeland on Ulthuan, as Naggaroth. The loyalist elves in turn considered this then in essence a settlement of the issue. Some further military expeditions against the traitorous Dark Elves were launched over the years, but the general belief was that they could not possibly ever rebuild on any kind of scale sufficient to threaten Ulthuan again, as Naggaroth now most assuredly deserved its name, Land of Chill, covered in de facto permanent frost and enormous icy mountains. Nothing, with the exception of hardy pine trees, could possibly ever grow there. It was no suitable home for any sort of a civilization, and surely Malekith and his devious hordes would simply starve or freeze to death in the chilly wastes. Unfortunately for Phoenix King Kalidor's lot, they had severely underestimated the tenacity of their soon-to-be dark cousins. And perhaps more importantly, in fact, absolutely, surely more importantly, the sustainability of the Black Arks, without which the Dark Elves would not be alive today. The shards of sunken Naggaroth were rammed into the shores of new Naggaroth, and became Malekith's cities. They were designed for far warmer climates, of course, but with some modifications here and there, they provided the single most crucial thing in a cold weather environment: shelter. Without which, you're not going to have the time to worry about any of the other niceties of one's continued existence, like fresh water or food, as you'll freeze to death in the first night. And even so, that was the fate for many of Malekith's brood, as again, the Black Arks were hardly designed for this environment. Using magic, however, they were swiftly modified, closed off, and more properly heated. After which, the fresh citizens of Naggaroth could finally start worrying about their rapidly dwindling food supplies. But the establishment of Naggaroth as a nation in and of itself is not the subject of today's video, rather the Black Arks are. It swiftly became obvious that yes, this was a pretty damn terrible place to live, you see. And if the Dark Elves were to have any hope of sustainable living here, they were going to need a lot of things. They were going to need a stable food source. They were going to need access to fresh water. They were going to need the niceties without which life is simply not worth living. And bearing in mind that the only reason why they'd bother fleeing in the first place was, of course, to one day facilitate Malekith's return to the Phoenix throne, they were going to need a lot of other things as well: iron, weapons, beasts of burden and of war. And Naggaroth was not providing any of these things. But to add insult to injury, the Dark Elves were not really in any position to go out and fetch them either. They were alive now, mostly because the High Elves figured they'd die anyway in a year or two. If a concerted military effort were made against them, they'd stand practically no chance, except hoping that Malekith could pull another magical miracle out of his arse, essentially. Fortunately, King Kalidor was getting a bit sick of the expenses of the war as well. The entirety of Ulthuan pretty much needed to be rebuilt, so organizing a mass military expedition to the frozen hellish north, where Malekith was sure to freeze and die soon anyways, really wasn't much of a priority. But unable to strike back at Ulthuan, or launch raids against the now old world or any of the established areas, Malekith's followers were simply out of options, until something almost killed them. As they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and in this case, the thing that got closest to wiping the Dark Elves out completely wasn't the environment. Oh, it was, making a good go of it, no doubt, but it was the barbarian hordes descending from the north that got the closest to putting the final nail in the coffin. Even at this early point in Warhammer's history, there were major human empires across the earth. Not nearby, but scattered across areas like Nehekara or even the Far East. But up here in the north, the closest thing you came to an empire were hundreds of scattered tribes, most of which already deeply in the service of the Dark Gods. And apparently their masters were not too fond of the company that arrived upon their shores. Enormous hordes of barbarians began to descend upon the Dark Elves' holdings, surrounding their Black Arks and placing them under siege. Under normal circumstances, this would be no challenge whatsoever. A bunch of fur-clad barbarians wielding bronze or even wooden weaponry against the might of Naggaroth? It wouldn't even be a contest, were it not for the fact, of course, that all of their weapons, once more, were designed for Ulthuan. There were no beautiful, slender trees here with which to resupply them with shafts for spears or for arrows. Even the bows themselves began to splinter and crack in the unyielding frost. Their armor was not insulated in the slightest. Even touching a plate of fine elven steel could see your hand near permanently fused to it. It would take a long time for the Dark Elves to even begin to learn the lessons that Naggaroth were teaching them, and even when they started figuring out solutions to certain problems, like beginning to produce crossbows, for example, or more intricate and insulated armor, they needed to create the industry with which to produce them from the ground up, now isolated within their black arks. Thus, out of simple necessity, they couldn't build out their cities enough. All of their industry, all of their smiths, all of their weapon shops and fractories needed to be within the defensive confines of the Arks. All other necessities, too, had to be located within the ships. The production of food, or even something so simple as water, needed to rely mostly on magic and elven ingenuity. Even then, there was some harsh years ahead before the barbarians were finally broken. And this also introduced the Dark Elves to their first source of slave labor, which was to become the beating heart of elven industry in their bleak new homeland. Their rapid adoption of mass slave labor and the full organization and centralization of their society around the Black Arks would in the end turn out to be a blessing in disguise, but I guarantee you, freezing, smashing their priceless furniture for kindling within their darkened hulks in the early years, the elves were not seeing the promises of tomorrow quite so clearly. Nevertheless, after having survived the ravages of the barbarian, and eventually turning them into prey for their endless slave pens, the Dark Eldar were situated enough to begin scheming once again. Malekith would, of course, engineer a war between the High Elves and the Dwarves, which would bring both empires low. Unfortunately for Malekith, his counter-offensive against the High Elves after the War of Vengeance, or the War of the Beard, depending upon whom you're asking, failed to secure him his birthright, which relegated the Dark Elves to raiders first and foremost, and invaders, or reclaimers, as they would probably put it, only relatively rarely. The main duty of the Black Arks today is to supply Naggaroth with the enormous quantities of plunder that it requires. Military materiel, steel, iron, ore, food, luxuries, gold, and most importantly of all, an unending stream of slaves. The only problem is that acquiring these riches is quite the challenge. Quite a logistical challenge, actually. Sure, you could simply raid south towards Lustria, and you may very well acquire both magical artifacts and gold, but you're gonna have to wrestle it from the lizardmen, who tend to be somewhat jealous guardians of their treasures. More often than not, raiding the coast of Lustria is not really worth it, especially as there's not really a coast to raid. You're going to have to head deep inland into the fetid jungles to discover the Lizardmen's temple cities and attack them. A massive undertaking for uncertain reward. Such a course of action would also bring the Black Ark uncomfortably close to Ulthuan. And as you can probably imagine, the High Elves take a dim view of the Dark Elves crossing through their territorial waters. A far more popular target is the Old World, with the nations of the Empire, Bretonia, Estalia, Intelea, and further to the south again, Araby. These are a far safer distance from Ulthuan, their ancestral enemies, but the trip is even longer. A captain with a bit of caution in his blood will head north first, and follow the coast of the Chaos Wastes as closely as he dares, bearing in mind the unnatural nature of the ocean-going predators of the area. But it is still far easier to navigate with land in sight than trying the straight crossing from Naggaroth to the Old World. Especially as the larger aquatic creatures of the Warhammer world are not limited merely to the Chaos Wastelands, and some of the true shipbreakers live far, far out to sea. Normally then, the Chaos Wastelands would be skirted, until a crossing to Norska can be made, and then they would follow the coast yet again, before heading south to Bretonia. Slightly more adventurous captains might try to use Albion for much the same purpose, but the druids inhabiting that island are not too fond of visitors, and the magic rolling fog surrounding the island can cause difficulties for even the most experienced of Dark Elf captains. This long journey is another reason why it was a bit of a blessing in disguise that so much of Dark Elf industry and logistic centers were gathered on board the Black Arks. This is a journey of many, many months. Any normal ship would be hard-pressed to carry enough food and fresh water for the journey. For even a small crew, never mind the thousands of corsairs usually embarked upon a Black Ark, and the dozens upon dozens of ships, and the enormous holding pens for both loot and slaves. The Black Arks become, in essence, floating cities, capable of sustaining themselves on occasion for years and years, as the more ambitious Dread Lord pirates will plan to be gone for half a decade or more at a time. This lengthy perspective means also, of course, that the raids themselves become monstrously expensive. The corsairs will need to be paid. The personnel working aboard the Black Arks will need to be paid, or enslaved alternatively. Even then, they're still going to need food, they're still going to need water, they're still going to need the at least most base accommodations. And many of the corsairs and the captains and the lords are going to require significantly more costly accommodations as well. Luxury goods and various ritual appliances as well, as part of the reason why the Black Arks can even stay afloat, of course, is magic. Magic that will require fueling. There is also plentiful of other reasons to bring along a few sorceresses to dissuade the hungry critters of the deep, dark depths, for example, to try and make a quick snack out of a Black Ark. Now, granted, the Black Arks are tough meals, and make no mistake about it, as they are fortified for every occasion, to the point that one, the Ravager of Souls, managed to survive entering the realms of chaos, beaching itself in Nurgle's own gardens. That was a hefty navigational mistake right there, which swiftly saw the ship, of course, be set upon by Nurgle's countless denizens. Somehow the ship managed to hold off the innumerable hordes of demonic monstrosities descending from above, as well as the swamps below, for long enough to allow the Ark's complements of sorceresses to pull the ship back into the real world. Speedy retreat aside, the simple fact that the Black Ark managed to survive for any amount of time in the middle of the realm of chaos in Nurgle's garden says a lot about how tough a nut they are. Now, of course, Grandfather Nurgle couldn't simply let such an offense fly, badum-dish, and so simply sat back and waited until the Black Ark made it back home again to the city of Arnhem whereupon he opened a second rift, invaded the city, decimated the population, and spread plague across all of Naggaroth. It hardly needs mentioning, but this did not make the Ravager of Souls or its captains very popular in that land. Still, their achievement of holding off the hordes of Nurgle, even temporarily, stands. This defensive ability, along with their sheer bulk and capacity to haul unfathomable quantities of cargo, is another of the primary benefits of the Black Arks. See, the lengthy journey, months and months to sea, would leave any normal crew, not to mention their ships, in a less than ideal state. The shipbuilding technology in the old world is, to varying degrees, sophisticated, to the point where transatlantic crossings are possible, but by and large, after making such a heroic journey, the vessel is not going to be able to simply turn around and do it again without lengthy repairs. But the Black Arks are capable of just that, and with vast internal harbour systems, they can carry with them dozens of smaller raiding ships, delivering them onto target in tip-top condition, even carrying out any and all necessary repairs of ships damaged during voyages or in engagements with enemy coastal patrols, and continuing on the journey whilst doing so. Essentially, it's a mobile port, allowing the Dark Elf Corsairs to launch raids against the coastline with the safety of a home base right out to sea. Now, only rarely does the Black Ark itself join in the raiding, as they are far too valuable to risk, and despite their size and significant armaments, they can and have been sunk. And considering the resources required to create a new one, literally a part of a landmass, you really don't want to lose them, as the big man back in Naggaroth takes that kind of stuff very personally. Though there are certain instances in which the risking of a Black Ark might be worth it, if the booty is great enough. As mentioned previously, in many cases, when a Black Ark sets out to sea, it is expected to be gone for years and years and years, as it takes a very long time to recoup the tremendous expenses placed in mobilizing one of these things. However, there are a handful of areas in the old world where one might gain fantastical riches relatively quickly. One such opportunity was exploited by the Citadel of Spite, a Black Ark operating out of Clar Carond under the command of one Dreadlord Mengil. Mengil had spent quite a few decades raiding the old world and had become a seasoned veteran Dreadlord captain. Yet, always seeking to make a name for himself, he embarked upon a particularly ambitious course of action, planting the Citadel of Spite squarely in the entrance to the Sea of Tilea, the only way in to the nation of Tilea, a huge trade metropolis. Doing so, he was not only able to raid the nearby villages for slaves and a pittance and booty here and there, but also he could throw up a net of warships that could catch every merchant vessel making its way to and from Tilea. The money was quite literally pouring in veritable waterfalls of gold. But his actions quickly came to the notice of the High Elves, whom, seeing an opportunity to catch a Black Ark in the relatively confined waters of the Sea of Tilea, where escape would be extremely difficult, dispatched a High Elf fleet to bring it to heel. Wisely choosing their moment to strike, They attacked when the Black Ark's captain, Mengil, was ashore. Expecting this to force the Black Ark to stand and fight, the High Elves were swiftly disappointed as the Citadel of Spite sailed out to sea, making the best possible speed away from its embattled fleet and its now stranded captain. Unwilling to risk the none-too-friendly attentions of the various sea monsters operating out of the darker depths of the ocean, and having now lost their advantage of catching the Citadel of Spite in the confined waters of the Sea of Telea, the elves shadowed the vessel but made no further overt attempt to sink it. Having thus eventually evaded his pursuers, the Dark Elf captain made the decision to head for home. He had a hold bulging with treasure, with merchandise and slaves, and his commander, his dreadlord Mengil, well, he was clearly lost. He must have been cut down by vengeful peasants, or hunted down by the Teleans by now, surely. It would only place the powerful and valuable Black Ark in yet further danger should he turn around now. Or alternatively, he simply saw the opportunity and grabbed for it. Now, unfortunately for him, Mengil wasn't actually dead, and he would go on to making a name for himself as a mercenary, that name being Mengil Manhide, the person famous for flaying the hides of his defeated foes and, well, wearing them as cloaks. Incidentally, Mengil's own hide cloak is created from the captain who betrayed him. Oh well, what goes around comes around, as they say. There have even been Arks that have cantered off on even more ambitious voyages. The Talon of Agony, for example, found itself sunk, so a less than entirely successful voyage, off the coast of Cathay. About 1,000 years or so before the rise of Sigmar, sunk by a rogue wave. Somehow I suspect that the locals had something to do with that wave, considering the Black Ark itself is, a floating mountain, but hey, probably a reference to the tsunami that saved the Japanese in our own story, I would guess. Regardless of the unfortunately watery fate of the Talon of Agony, however, it does prove that the Black Ark is capable of not just the essential equivalent of a transatlantic voyage, in fact the damn thing can circumnavigate the globe practically, speaking volumes as to its durability and the sheer amount of supplies you can pack aboard the thing. Not to mention the obvious confidence of the dread lords who captained them. Going that far away from any form of support, you'd better be damned sure that your Black Ark can survive whatever it's thrown its way. And, well, considering it sank, I suppose this particular individual was a little bit overly optimistic. But by and large, there are very few things that can deal with a Black Ark. Usually, magic is dealt with by, well, more magic, as aforementioned wave. There is also occasions where entire Black Arks have been, well, frozen in, literally stuck in the areas near the Chaos Wastes, or sunk or overcome by superior naval forces, or dragons, that's another one. Back in the good old days of the Dragon Princes, when they rode actual, literal dragons rather than merely decorated horses, even the Black Arks were not quite so mighty as they are today. But now, there are very few things that can touch them. The Empire probably have the best bet, as they of course use a great deal of gunpowder weaponry on their ships. Big old cannons will put paid even to a Black Ark's armor, though even then, we are talking actual castle walls here that float, so it will require a sustained bombardment. And during all of that time, of course, any fleet eager or dumb enough to get close is going to be exposed to a withering barrage of rapid-firing ballistas, rapid-firing crossbows, and the occasional magical bolt as well. As mentioned, most Black Arks go to sea with a sizable complement of sorceresses. And, of course, you won't even have to deal just with the Ark, but with its own personal navy that goes wherever it goes, cradled within its bosom, ready to sally forth to make any attack upon its mothership a significantly more challenging affair. All in all, the Black Arks of Naggaroth are damn near unsinkable, as demonstrated by the fact that only a handful of them have ever been sunk, despite the fact that they've been launching slaving and raiding actions against the coast of the Old World and Ulthuan for thousands of years. And there's very little to suggest that they're going to be stopping anytime soon. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.